Hello, listeners. Jordan here. I just want to let you know that you can listen to Nighttime early and ad-free on Amazon Music. Include it with Prime.
You are listening to Canadian Gothic, a series by the Nighttime Podcast.
Hello, listeners. This episode is going to take us to the community of Buffalo Narrows in Saskatchewan. The story we're going to share is one of Canada's worst acts of mass murder. On a cold night in January of 1969, 19-year-old Fred McCallum entered the Pederson family home as they slept. When he leaves the home, he'd be covered in blood, carrying a large axe, and unsure of what exactly he did to the Pederson family. Tonight, in this episode of Nighttime, I'll be joined by Canadian crime content creator Madelayne Klein to explore the Buffalo Narrows axe murders. Let's get into it. Miss Madelayne Klein, your cat was there bothering you. It's gone now. Life is back to normal. How are you?
I'm great. Just hanging out. He's gone for now. Let's not count our chickens.
Let's not count our cats before they leave for good. You say you're good or you're great. Do you want to elaborate on it?
Nothing too crazy, new and exciting. But actually, I almost won tickets to Kiss today because of you.
What?
Yeah. So Kiss announced their tour yesterday, and so you and I were kind of talking Kiss. And whatever, you were just kind of giving me some trivia.
Well, no, that's called telling you, like, that's not talking. I was telling you things about Kiss. I was mansplaining Kiss to you. And you were too kind to, like, make me stop.
Well, you know what? It worked out to my benefit. So, yeah, so I'm listening to the radio this morning, as I always do. And they're giving away tickets. And, I mean, as my dad always says, I'll go if it's free. Mm-hmm. So I'm listening, and they say, in 1978, all four of the members released their own solo albums. And right away, I knew what the question was going to be. It was going to be whose was the most successful, because it's not Gene Simmons.
Right.
So as soon as he said, which album, I texted in Ace Frehley. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so it was which album was the most successful. And originally, the one guy said, okay, first person to get it right gets it. And I would have won because I sent it in before the question was even asked. Wow. But then the other guy was like, no, whatever, texture number 20, whatever.
Yeah, they never pick the first person. It's
like
11th person to get this right. But that's
so
crazy.
You almost won me Kiss tickets.
We were just, and the reason that I even mentioned that to you is because I was at I was at Valley Village, like a thrift store, and on the shelf was you may have seen the video I made online on TikTok. I think I found Ace's solo album, but it was all damaged. So I made this video.
That's what that was.
How would someone do this? Why would they do this? But yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, it was, just how the stars aligned. So
well, I'm sad you didn't get the tickets, but
me too.
Well, I got tickets for Jerry Seinfeld. He's coming to Halifax over the summer for like an outdoor comedy festival. So that was, I guess, my excitement today. I also was at the Halifax Central Library, which is a large library in the center of downtown Halifax. Scenic and beautiful. It's 4 or 5 stories high. It has a rooftop patio, 2 coffee shops, and they contacted me because I guess they had a lot of library patrons who requested having a nighttime podcast themed show happen in the library. So I was meeting with them today, working on some ideas for an upcoming kind of meet and greet live recording show kind of thing at the library. So that was another busy part of my day. I was excited for that, but details will be announced whenever they're determined.
Well, that sounds wonderful.
I'm going to tell them to fly you in. I'm like, if you want to make this big, do you know? And I'll be like, do you know what Saskatchewan is? And the person
fly in all the guests.
Yeah, the person will be like, yes, I've heard of Saskatchewan. I'm like, well, there's actually a person there that I know, and we'll bring you down.
Someone lives there, and I know them.
I found them online. They have internet and everything. Anyway, enough of that. Let's get into it here. We're here for a very, very, very dark and crazy story, one that I had never known. I've only found out about this story because I was I don't know what I was researching. I think I was something to do with the Nova Scotia mass casualty. I was researching past mass murders in Canada, and I found on, I think it was on Wikipedia, there was a list of like, the worst mass murders in Canada. And one that stood out to me that I had never heard of was the 1969 Buffalo Narrows axe murders. It stood out to me, I think, because it had the word axe in it, and it's just like, woo, that sounds like a horror movie. Um, the Wikipedia entry for it was pretty sparse, but from there, I just kind of went digging in. The picture that emerges in this story is a whole lot to talk about. But before we get into what happened, you're in Saskatchewan. This story took place January 30th, 1969, in Buffalo Narrows, Saskatchewan. Have you ever heard of this place?
I've definitely heard of it.
Okay.
It's pretty far up north.
Mhm.
So, and yeah, well, and I think I mixed it up with a different place. I thought maybe I had been like camping there before, but it's pretty remote. So I don't
Mhm.
think I have been there.
Yeah, it sounds pretty remote and a very small place. At least in 69 when this happened, Buffalo Narrows had a population that ranged between like 500 and 700 people. And the way it was described, at least in 69, I don't know how if it's changed much. The majority of the population, the overwhelming majority, was Cree or Métis, Métis, I think is the pronunciation. Um, there was only a handful of white residents, and listen to this, is when almost all of the white residents, if not all of them, that lived there worked in either government, policing, education, or missionary positions like religion sort of thing. So I don't know, it seems weird to hear of a place with that kind of makeup and structure.
Yeah, it's pretty colonizy, but
It has that vibe, and it's when we get to the story, as I mentioned, this happens January 30th, so it happens in winter. One thing that's important to note, and I guess to picture in your mind about Buffalo Narrows, is there was only one road in and out from Buffalo Narrows, and it wasn't maintained during the winter. They just allowed it to get, this community was just, I guess, willingly, or maybe had no choice. They were just snowed in. So in the winter, the only way in or out of there was by something described as a bush plane. I had never heard of that. I looked up what a bush plane is, and what I would say is it's a small, super sketchy plane is the only way in and out all winter.
well, my dad used to work like up north and in super remote areas, and so I know exactly what kind of plane that
Mm.
yeah, it's like yeah, super small, maybe like 3 or 4 seats,
A crop,
including the
okay.
pilot.
Yeah, I've heard as a crop duster, some would call it.
Yeah.
The smallest I've ever been on. There's a plane that goes from St. John, New Brunswick to Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is a very short distance. But this plane, it's bigger than these bush planes. But I got on it once, and there's maybe, I don't know, like maybe 15 seats or something, and I like get on and I sit there and I'm just like, oh, like this is a very small plane. And then someone comes in and they, rather than like a TV or a recording where it explains how to put on the belt and all this, it's just like a guide. He's talking and showing us how all this stuff works. And then the guy just like sits down at the seat and like with like a key, like starts the plane. I'm like, oh, that's the pilot. And he's just like
I
sitting
right.
there. Yeah, it was
I
very
took a
freaky.
plane like that from Halifax to Fredericton once.
Yeah,
And I was like, oh my God, what's
yeah, he's just
happening?
right there, like driving it's like you're in his cab. He's just his hand on the wheel,
And
pushing
then I was
buttons.
and then I was explaining to my friend's mom in Fredericton, my experience on this plane. She goes, as long as the pilot was sober, you're fine. And I was like,
Yeah,
well, she's not wrong.
yeah, yeah. Well, I guess that in the winter in Buffalo Narrows, that's I guess what life is like. But one other thing before we get into the story, I guess just to set the scene, in Buffalo Narrows in 1969, um, it's only about just over 300 kilometers, 350 kilometers away from Shell Lake, which only a little over a year before what happened in Buffalo Narrows was coincidentally, one of Canada's other worst acts of mass murder, the Shell Lake massacre. And that was a mass shooting where one person killed pretty much an entire family, I believe. I think you did a video on Shell Lake, did you
I
not?
was going to say I covered that video a couple months ago, and
Mhm.
that's how I found out about this case. Is someone commented and was like, "Well, did you hear about the other Pederson family?
Yeah,
And I thought, like, what?
yeah, we'll get into that as we go, but the similarities between these two stories are nuts. Going right down to the family name. The in a year and a half before what happened in Buffalo Narrows, it happened in something similar happened in Shell Lake to a family called the Petersons. But here in Buffalo Narrows, we're going to be talking about the Pedersons with a D rather than a T, and it's just a bizarre coincidence, but there are other coincidences between these two stories that we'll get to. So to set the scene for the story, again, we talked a little bit about Buffalo Narrows. We're in January 30th of 1969. To set the scene, this story takes place in the Pederson home, Pederson with a D in the middle, P-E-D. And the best way to think of this, it's a large family, but in a small 2-bedroom, single-story home. We have the father and mother, Thomas and Bernadette Pederson. At the time of the story we're going to get to, they're asleep in their bedroom. They have a friend of the family who's staying over. His name is John Baptiste Herman. He's a 48-year-old man who is sleeping on a couch in the living room. So mom and dad, both early 30s in their bedroom. The guest, late 40s on the couch. And then in the other bedroom is 5 children. There's Grace Ann Pederson, who's 8. Tommy Pederson, who's 5. Richard Daniel Pederson, who's 4. Rhonda Beatrice Pederson, who's 2 years old. And Donnie Pederson, who's 7. So we have the 5 children in the bedroom. There are 2 other kids in this family, but as circumstance have it, the other 2 are actually aren't staying in the home. They're staying with their grandmother, which is quite fortunate as we'll get going here. But first of all, I don't know if you've seen any photos of the Pederson family, but that's a hell of a lot of people for this small house. I can't imagine raising 7 kids in a 2-bedroom, tiny little single-story bungalow.
That's like a nightmare to me, but totally the norm back then, especially small town Saskatchewan.
I would think so, yeah. The 2 children, I didn't say their names, but the 2 children who are staying with their grandmother is Connie and Cynthia. And again, as we'll get into the story, it's quite fortunate that they weren't home that night. So we have the scene set here with this family. The other person who makes his way into this story is a local man who is known to this family named Fred McCallum. And I guess we'll introduce him before we get into what actually happens. Do you want to tell us a bit about Fred?
Fred McCallum was a 19-year-old main team man from Buffalo Narrows. Mm-hmm. And he was familiar with the family. I'm unsure how. I think just acquaintances or friends.
As a community of 500 to 700 people, I think it's probably hard not to be acquainted with everyone.
That's true.
Yeah.
But yeah, he came from a large family of, I believe, 8 mm-hmm. or 11 siblings. I can't remember the exact. I don't know why I'm between those numbers.
Yeah, he had 8 siblings. But an interesting thing is he was raised by his mom, and all 8 siblings were from a different father.
That's correct.
Yeah, and his mom struggled quite a bit with alcoholism, which led to Fred McCallum being kind of bounced from foster home to foster home. I believe it was at age 11 that he was taken from his mother's home and bounced from foster home to foster home, but he was always kind of in the area of Buffalo Narrows, so it's not like he was shipped out, across the country sort of thing.
Right. Yeah, he never went far. Mm-hmm. So I believe he spent all of his life in the area.
Yeah, and as far as like background with crime and stuff, Fred wasn't a saint by any stretch, but he was never in big trouble. He did some time in prison, but I couldn't find out what he did, but it was for minor crimes. So I'm guessing by minor, I've seen it described as minor crimes multiple times. To me, that would be petty crime, maybe assault, but not like he did
like theft.
Yeah, he didn't do any serious.
But if you think about it, so he did a little bit of time in 66, but he was only 19 in 1969. So he would have been 16 in 66.
Yeah.
So he would have just been like super young.
Yeah. Yeah, I never really thought about that, that it was, yeah, it was
Yeah.
3 years before the actual murders in Buffalo Narrows that he was in prison. So yeah, he would have been just 16. But needless to say, what will become important, I guess, is when he's in prison at this point, at 16 years old, 3 years before the murders that he's going to be connected to, he was beginning to show early signs of some kind of mental illness. It's reported that during his time in prison, he talked about hearing voices, seeing things. Um, he would hear news, he would hear like the radio talking about the news, and he often was thinking they were talking about him and would get upset. So it's like, I think even just that alone, when you hear that, you're like, okay, this, 16-year-old hearing voices and being paranoid, this is not,
The writing
he's,
on the wall isn't good.
yeah, certainly. And as you mentioned, he did have some connection to the Pederson family, probably just as a result of being in the same small community. But 2 days before the crimes we're going to hear about, he was at their house, January 28th, 2 days before the murders. There was some kind of party at the Pederson family home that involved a lot of alcohol. Fred was at the party and got into a little, not like physical fight, but an argument with the Pedersons, the mother and father, Thomas and Bernadette. And the argument was over alcohol. It seems like he wanted Bernadette to give him alcohol and she wouldn't. And he like kind of like threw a fit. And I've seen it described as she kicked him out. And I also seen it described as she threw him out of a bedroom rather than out of the house. But regardless, he was there and they weren't giving him liquor, and
There was a dispute.
there was a dispute. Whether or not that dispute is the motivation for what will happen 2 days later on January 30th, we'll never know, because he has never said any explanation as to what happened. But we'll get to the night in question, which again, January 30th of 69, in that small 2-story home, minus 40-degree weather outside, brutal cold. And this happens in the middle of the night. Whatever happens, happens. Now, there's a lot of holes in the timeline of what goes down, because there's a lot we simply don't know, because the only witness to any of it is Fred, and he hasn't been able to say much about it. But what we do know is that Fred enters the Pederson family home while they're all sleeping, the children all in one room, the parents in the other, and the family friend asleep on the couch. He shows up at the home and he punches through the glass of their front door, unlocks the door, and he enters the home with a large fire axe. And if you're familiar with a fire axe, it'd be similar to what a firefighter would use. It's a long wooden handle, a single blade on the end, and like a large heavy axe, not like a hatchet. We're talking big axe. What happens inside the home, the order of how it happens, if anyone puts up a fight or not, we don't know, because Fred's version of the story, Fred McCallum, the 19-year-old, is that he doesn't remember entering the house. He doesn't remember any of this. He remembers coming to in the bedroom with the children. His first memory is that he smells blood, and he smells something odd, smells blood and like meat. And at that point, he realizes that there is blood everywhere. There are people dead on the ground all around him. And according to him, his first instinct is like, who did this? I got to catch them. I know the kids who are here dead. I got to catch who did this. But then he catches his reflection in the mirror of of a dresser, and sees himself holding an axe covered in blood. And it's at that point that he realizes he's responsible, and he starts making his way out of the house, and in doing so walks by the brutally murdered bodies of everybody else in the house.
That is a textbook schizophrenic episode, though. Like
That is how it sounds, eh?
being jolted back into reality, like when you realize what's happening. Lots of
Yeah.
like violent and gory scenes can jolt someone back into reality.
It seems like that is what happens. He leaves the home and he goes to a neighbor's house, which is actually an aunt and cousin. Now, again, in a small community like this, a lot of people are related. He shows up at a neighbor's home, a little after it's about 2:30 a.m.
I thought it was a little after 3.
Yeah, I think you're right. A little after 3, and he shows up. His 15-year-old cousin lets him in the house, and it's at that point he explains what he had done, or at least what he thought he did, and he doesn't think they'll believe him. So he's even showing them, like, look on my arm, and I have blood stains up and down my arm. Um, his aunt gets on the phone with the 15-year-old. He's explaining to them what happened. And the next step is kind of a puzzling one. What he does next is he calls a priest. He's very worried, Fred is, that he wants a priest to go to the house and do, they call it like the last rites, which is like reading a prayer or something to some before someone dies. He calls the priest in this community, begging him, like, right now you have to go immediately to this house. I killed people, but some of them aren't dead yet. Fred believed that a couple of the children were still alive. He was begging this priest to get to the home as soon as possible and perform these last rites. And the priest actually took the call twice. The first time hung up because he thought, whoever's calling me is just a drunk lunatic. And that would make sense. You get a call, after 3 a.m. with this sort of thing. It would take a minute to realize what's happened. But when Fred calls back and explains it again to the priest, he's like, ooh, like, I gotta go over there.
Right.
And it's actually the priest is the first one who shows up at the scene. He goes in the house and finds, again, a house full of 8 people who've been brutally attacked in the head with a fire axe.
I think part of them just still didn't believe him.
Well, why
part
would
of the
you,
priest,
I think?
Yeah, I think part of the priest was still like, this guy's seeing things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it would make sense, but the priest arrives, and seeing is believing with something like this. And of course the priest quickly leaves the home. At this point, they're believing all 8 people in the home are dead. The priest calls police, telling them what he found and about the call he made and everything else. And that's when the police arrive to the scene. Police split up. One group go to get Fred from his aunt and cousin's house, and they find him sitting at the kitchen table drinking a cup of tea at a little after 3 a.m, covered in blood. And then the other police, the other police who show up at the house. And this is a really kind of twisted scene. A lot of the story where we were able to find it is by sorting through old newspapers from the time, from '69, that had interviews and quotes with people involved, and that covered the trial, where you get to see like quotes from people on the stand. But when the police enter the home, they first go in and believe everybody in the house is dead, but then after the police clear the space, like sort of like nurses go in, where I guess they're probably going to put like the bodies in body bags and stuff. And at one spot, a nurse walks in a room where all the children are and turns on a flashlight. And when she does, one of the children just sit up, which is like a horror movie. It's Donnie, which is the young son of the Pedersons. He was laying still up until this point. He's only 7 years old. Despite having life-altering injuries to the front and back of his head, he managed to survive, at least immediately. They also found the Bernadette Pederson, the 32-year-old mother. She wasn't conscious, but she was showing signs of life. So they were able to take Bernadette and Donnie out of the home into the hospital while they deal with the rest of the scene. But we won't get into the gritty detail of this, but when I say it was like a horror movie, this was it was apparent that Fred spent considerable time with each victim. It wasn't like they were all in their beds when they were murdered, and it wasn't one like strike with an axe. It was like a brutal, vicious beating, specifically with the axe. So I don't know if I can imagine a more gory and grotesque scene than what these police and priests found.
It was a slaughter.
That's a good way to put it. Fortunately, Donnie when he gets to the hospital, he's in intensive care, but he's seeming to come around. It's looking good for him. Bernadette, however, unfortunately, she succumbed to her injuries only 2 or 3 hours after arriving to the hospital. So I'm imagining that she probably had just like vague signs of life, but not enough that they could, turn it around. We should move on to the actual arrest of Fred. We talked about the police arriving to his aunt and cousin's house and finding him sitting at the table drinking tea. The story of it's one officer who shows up and arrests him and takes him into custody, but the whole conversation they have was kind of retold during the trial, and it is quite shocking. When the police officer approaches Fred, who's again sitting at the table with the tea, he tells Fred, "You're under arrest for murder," and Fred just casually responds like, "I killed them, so what?" They cuff him and take him to the car. Fred defends himself because I think they first told him like you killed 8 people, and he explains, "No, I didn't kill them all. There's still 3 of them alive." But Fred explains, "I wanted to kill more. I wanted to get you," meaning the police, "with the axe as well." And Fred, plain as day, says, "But when I get out of prison, I'm going to do it. I'm going to kill you when I get out," which is they must have been quite shocked taking him down with that. But it's like a calm, no empathy, completely casual, but vicious and evil scene.
Well, I'm wondering if is that how he delivered the news to his aunt, cousin, and the priest too, just like super nonchalant? Because I'm picturing him realizing what he did and panicking.
Mm-hmm.
And
all accounts from these people are that he was like clear and calm. The priest,
cool and collected.
The priest described him as sounding drunk. So
right.
I couldn't find anywhere else whether or not he was intoxicated. As far as I could tell from the news reports, that never came up at his trial at all, because he will face charges for these crimes, but the trial will largely hinge on, was he, mentally competent or not criminally responsible for this? So there wasn't really much analysis of anything else. Like he admitted to doing it, but it all came down to his mental state. But in a town of, just around 700 people, give or take the day, the mass murder of an entire family like this, and again, coming off of a year and a half earlier, something similar happened in a neighboring community. This absolutely rocked the community. The funeral in this town had 600 people in attendance in a town of 700. First of all, who were the 100 that didn't show up? But if your whole
well, and there were out of towners there, so
a couple hundred didn't show up. I was just kind of surprised to see that number. It's like, wow, that's a huge number, but it's a town of 700. So where are the others? But it's I've seen photos in the newspaper reports of the time showing this funeral, and you see just a line of caskets, and many of them much smaller, of course, where we're talking about children as young as 2 years old being murdered by a maniac with an axe. You see all the caskets, and then behind them, it's just a wall of people in this tiny little village.
I want to say unfathomable, but it's the second time it happened. Like,
yeah, and we'll get into that, because it is so bizarre that the 2 mass murders happened so close together with such similar circumstances. We'll talk a little bit about the trial against Fred McCallum. I don't know if you found any explanation for this, but this part didn't make sense to me. The initial news reports, he's standing trial, facing 7 charges of non-capital murder, is what he was charged with. So the original news reports are all about he's pleading not guilty to the 7 charges. He's being held in custody facing several charges. And then all of a sudden, the newspaper reports are saying, And actually, I should also say there was many delays leading up to the trial actually starting because he was going through so many kind of psychological reviews and stuff to confirm he was competent to stand trial. And there was also a publication ban, so the news reporting is pretty vague. But then all of a sudden, when the trial is about to kick off, he was only facing 2 counts of murder, and the two murders he was being charged with were the 2 adult men. So, for example, Bernadette, the 32-year-old woman he killed, he wasn't being charged with her murder or any of the children that he killed, just the family friend and the father. And I could not find any explanation for that, unless it maybe was one of these negotiation sort of things.
Well, I think, and I should have looked into this, but there had to be some sort of stipulation or loophole or something back then, because the Shell Lake massacre, the one that happened just 18 months before, whatever it was, there were 9 murders, 2 parents, 7 children, and the person was only charged for murder of the parents.
I wonder if it's like at the time there still would have been capital punishment in Canada. Like
Yeah.
and I wonder if it was the kind of thing where it's like, some crimes, some types, some murders or whatever would make you eligible for the death penalty and some wouldn't. I wonder if there was like kind of a negotiation, like we're going to charge you with the ones that, would avoid the death penalty, and maybe there was something like that being done. I don't know, but I
Well,
couldn't
and I figure, or my thought process was, maybe maybe the system just doesn't want to like be overkill like the states. So
Mm,
they're like, well, we know we can get them for life on these 2.
mhm.
So we won't try and give them 7 life sentences and extend the trial. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, who knows what I'm just surprised that the news reports at the time didn't explain that. Because
Right.
yeah, because that should have been a big deal. And I also like your theory, like on why they would do it. That makes sense. But at the same time, the murders are all done as kind of like one collective act under the same circumstances. So it's not like they would need to call all this additional witnesses and evidence and stuff. It
Oh,
just
yeah.
seems a lot. I don't know. It doesn't make a lot of sense with me. And then why would you go with the 2 men rather? I don't know. Rather than the 3 adults. It is strange, but
The 60s were wild, man.
what a wild time. The trial was wild. There were several moments that were um, very noteworthy and newsworthy. One is we talked about how Donnie, the 7-year-old who survived, he continued to improve while in the hospital in the days and weeks after the attempt at murder against him. He did make a full recovery, and he actually appeared in the trial. He testified against Fred. Although he didn't remember much of anything, he did say that when asked by the lawyer, like, what happened to you, Donnie? He simply said, like, I got chopped. That's how he described it. When they asked, who did it to you? He pointed to Fred, who was sitting in the courtroom, but referred to him by his nickname, which is Benny. And he said, Benny did it. And pointed at him. So a 7-year-old boy in a courtroom, I think probably 8 at the time. That's a big moment. But the other big moment was they brought as evidence and displayed in the courtroom the axe that Fred or Benny had used to commit this crime. And I guess it was quite shocking because it still had signs of dried blood on it. It also had been like they had fingerprinted it, so they had to put that like kind of black ink on it to fingerprint it. So what they ended up displaying was this large, dirty, bloodstained axe in a brightly lit courtroom, which sounds like uh, a dramatic moment in a horror
So
movie or
it
something.
sounds like right out of the trial of Lizzie Borden.
Yeah, why do you need to see it? Like, could you not just tell us? Like, to actually bring the axe in, especially in a situation where it's a slam dunk that he did it without
It's
actually
pretty
having the
cut and
axe.
dry.
Yeah. Um, Here's an interesting thing about this trial. So we mentioned at the beginning that this community is predominantly made up of Cree and Métis Indigenous people, with the exception of government, police, religion, and teachers. The jury for this trial, it's a 12-person jury. All 12 people on the jury are male, and all 12 of them are white.
What a coincidence.
Is it
Isn't
a
it so
coincidence?
funny how things like that
Well,
happen?
you just roll the dice, and that's how it
Yeah.
winds up in this remote,
God.
predominantly indigenous place. But it's there was the defense did question that, but it was able to go ahead.
Yeah. They were
Yeah.
like, no, this is fine. I'm willing to bet there wasn't even like a call out for jury duty. They just like
No,
picked 12 of their buddies and were like, all right, guys, come on.
yeah, come on, we got to do this right quick.
Yeah,
Uh,
it'll only take about a week. Like,
that would never happen today, hey?
no, never.
Absolutely not.
A
Um,
trial like this would also go on for like months.
and yeah, I guess, or well, actually, I don't know because it's pretty clear based on all of the testimony that was given by the psychologists and whatnot that reviewed Fred. It's pretty obvious that he was going through like a schizophrenic sort of episode. But at the time in 1969, that wasn't known the way it is now. So the psychiatrist who delivered his um, report and spoke on behalf of what he thought was happening with Fred, he really had to explain like schizophrenia to the absolute layman. It seemed like when you're reading the newspaper, it almost seems like this new concept of like he did it, he may have done it, but he wasn't in a mental state where he could understand what he was doing and the consequences of it. But that's written about as if it's this new concept. Nowadays in 2023, it comes up so often that it's just if you follow crime, about these kind of the not criminally responsible or like not guilty by reason of insanity sort of defense. But
And yet there's still a stigma around it. Not as bad, obviously, than, 50 years ago, but there's still a stigma.
yeah, well, I don't even know if stigma is right. There are just a lot of people who disagree that that it's an illness rather than like if this happened today and you went on Facebook and you saw news about, this man is saying he's not criminally responsible and, he's schizophrenic, you would see the comments under it would be like, burn him downtown, hang him from the nearest pole,
And those are all the people that hashtag Bell Let's Talk.
oh,
Guaranteed.
you see that? One of the best things I've done in my life is on Twitter, you can mute certain hashtags. So I mute it like $ Bell Let's Talk and $ Trump. And like my life has got I live in just this utopia when I log into Twitter now.
The algorithm is on fire.
Yeah, it's just working. So Benny's trial, again, the majority of it surrounds his mental competency. It's a slam dunk that he did it. The jury deliberates for 4.5 hours. And they come back with the verdict that he's not guilty due to not being criminally responsible. Actually, I don't know what the right terminology is. I used to know it as like not guilty by reason of insanity, but
That's what I would.
that's what
know it
I
as.
think what you call it is NCR for not criminally responsible. So, but I don't know if they say like not guilty due to not criminally responsible, but ultimately the verdict is that he was.
I hope not. I don't like the way that sounds.
Could it also be like he's guilty, but he's not criminally responsible? Maybe is another way to say it, and that may flow a little better.
Maybe.
Yeah,
And it would make more sense because the not guilty by reason of insanity, they're still guilty. They did it. They're just insane. They just didn't, understand what they were doing at the time.
Yeah, or do you mean like guilty but not criminally responsible makes more sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Because not guilty by reason of insanity. That doesn't make sense because they are guilty.
Yeah. So, okay, I see what you're saying. He like this person is guilty, but he at the same time as being guilty, he's not criminally responsible due to a mental defect. Like
right. That makes a lot more sense.
Okay, we just figured it out. We'll let the courts know when we're finished up here.
Just gonna say, we'll report back. They'll be excited.
Yeah. A lot of interesting stuff happens after the trial. So we're talking here about this specific series of murders, but in the years after, a lot of interesting stuff happens. After Fred's convicted, he's diagnosed with schizophrenia and he's sent to a psychiatric institution, but not any. Listeners of my show will remember I did an episode on a mental health or a mental insane asylum. called Oak Ridge. It's in a place called I don't want to say it. Penna Tangu.
Pentanguishi?
Yeah, how do you know how to say that?
I practiced. You sounded out.
Wow, talented. Well, I'm gonna just go with Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge was a mental health hospital for the criminally insane, is how they put it back then. But this hospital is notorious in Canada as it was mainly run by this one doctor who had these really kind of wild and experimental kind of ideas on how to treat people who are found not criminally responsible for crimes. And his therapy involved all sorts of strange things like LSD treatment. So the criminals or the patients at the Oak Ridge Hospital were given large doses of LSD, uh, also known as acid. They were also given like this kind of like what sounds to me like torture therapy. On my episode that I did about Oak Ridge, I had a former inmate of Oak Ridge come on the show and talk about some of his experiences. And just to give an idea, he described this sort of therapy that they got where the inmates would have to go in a room together all naked as a way to kind of embarrass them, and then other inmates would have to be outside of the room and videotape them just being naked in the room as a way to kind of like embarrass and terrorize everyone, but also put them through this traumatic experience together. And this doctor who ran Oak Ridge, he had these theories about kind of like group therapy, but also the inmates kind of giving each other therapy. So it was, you hear the saying like the it's like the lunatics or the patients are running the asylum. There's like some therapy based, or not therapy, there's some saying based on that. But that was kind of like the practice there is they would.
Well, he thought, this doctor thought that these inmates, if they were responsible for each other or looking after each other, they would like see themselves in these inmates and like suddenly gain empathy
Hmm.
for one another. It didn't work.
No, certainly didn't work. In the
Well, and it was like 100 days. It was
yeah,
like a long time in
yeah,
the pod.
yeah, and the doctor's work and the doctor himself has been discredited. There's lawsuits always on the verge of happening with past inmates of this prison. There's several documentaries and books written about people's horrific experiences in this prison. But I just kind of find it kind of wild that of everywhere in the world or in Canada that Fred ends up in after this mass murder, it's at the Oak Ridge prison. And I contacted the inmate that I had known that I had on my show, the former inmate of Oak Ridge, to ask, like, did you know this guy? And he did. He said, like, yeah, he went there right around the time I was getting out, and he actually had he was like a big shot in there simply due to the fact that he had killed so many people. They saw that as like, a badge of honor, I guess, that you had done like a really horrendous crime. But kind of wild that of everywhere, that's where he ends up.
I've actually done a few cases from Saskatchewan where the murderer ends up in
Oak Ridge?
Oak Ridge. Yeah.
I had never heard about it until CBC did a documentary all about Oak Ridge, and I watched it. I was just blown away. And then I contacted one of the people from the documentary named Steve Smith and invited him on the show. And it just blew my mind what had happened in a country like Canada. You don't expect, like, I know the treatment of people suffering from mental illness in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was horrendous, I'm sure. But I didn't think in 1970 they'd be experimenting with LSD on these people.
Well, we have a little small town called Weyburn, and there was an old mental hospital there, and they were like one of the first in the world to experiment with LSD in the 30s.
Wow.
It's been closed forever, but
That's why all these places are haunted. Like you go to any like kind of insane asylum, like I don't think in the history of mankind, I think very few people have been tortured to the extent that the mentally ill were before we understood what they were dealing with. When you just
oh, totally.
the idea of giving someone a lobotomy, like we're basically like the way we're going to treat you is we're going to cut the front of your brain off so you're a
I,
living zombie.
I was just going to say, I wouldn't have lasted 4 minutes back then. I would have been lobotomized right away.
Yeah.
I would have been sentenced away for forever.
hmm So Fred ends up in Oak Ridge going through whatever he goes through, but he has largely disappeared from when he gets out of Oak Ridge. He just goes completely off the map. To this day, no one really knows where he is, but he is a free man. He got out of prison, rumored to be in Ontario, but nothing's for sure. He hasn't surfaced. However, the survivors have. So we had talked about the two children who stayed with their grandmother that night, Connie and Cynthia, now grown women, of course. They were the subject of a CBC documentary. It was like a radio documentary where they talked about life growing up with the rest of their family, having been murdered in this way, having not got any information from the justice system. They don't know anything about Fred, who he is, where he is, what his time, like, I don't know if they even knew he was in Oak Ridge because that didn't come up in that documentary at all. But
Which is bizarre.
yeah, because it's
Because,
notable, right?
like, and usually victims of like major crimes like this are always like updated on what the perpetrator's doing, what their parole schedule looks like, where they are.
Mhm.
But nothing. They didn't get anything.
This seems like nothing. And in fact, in that document, the CBC documentary where they interview them present day or close to present day, they compared their experiences with the justice system with what they know about the surviving family member from the Shell Lake murders. And it seems like the Shell Lake survivor, who was white, got very different, had a very different experience coming out of this in terms of support. It seems as though Connie, Cynthia, and Donnie were largely just fed to the wolves and had to fend for themselves coming out of this like absolutely unimaginable tragedy. Donnie's life especially, he's the 7-year-old who survived. He had a very troubled life. He was said to have almost had this like unsaid mission to find the killer of his family, Fred McCallum, in prison. And it seemed like Donnie almost had like this kind of not death wish, but this almost like jail wish to end up in prison. He was apparently in trouble a lot and in prison a lot. And a lot of people believed what he was trying to do was to be sent to the same prison that he thought Fred McCallum was in. He did get sent to the prison a few times, but never encountered McCallum. Donnie didn't realize that Fred was actually in Oak Ridge and not at just the regular prison in Saskatchewan, which is, I can kind of imagine that, but without getting much information from the justice system, you would be curious, absolutely. And you would probably want to get your hands on them.
Well, I would be vengeful.
Absolutely.
Very. Forgiveness is not my strong suit.
No. Donnie did have a family. He had 2 children, but he didn't have a full, long life. There's this other tragedy within this story. It was actually Donnie, who survived at 7 years old from the murders. His sister Cynthia and an uncle were driving together when they were in a vehicle driving kind of a rural road in the Buffalo Narrows area, and they were sideswiped by another car. Like the car rubbed against them and knocked the driver's side rear view mirror off. So they stopped the car, and Donnie actually gets out to survey the damage. So he opens his door, stops the car, opens the door, gets out, and he's looking at the damage. Cynthia and the uncle are on the other side of the vehicle, like off the shoulder of the road, watching him look at the damage, when another vehicle, a truck passing by, must not have seen Donnie in the road, and in front of his sister and uncle, hit him and kill him on the side of the road as he's surveying the damage from the prior vehicle. And even this scene is said to be quite gruesome and violent, that involved Donnie being thrown 30 feet from the vehicle from his car after being hit by this truck. And that's how his life ends, leaving Cynthia and Connie as the like the only survivors of their family.
Like, what are the odds that another major violent incident happened?
It's pretty awful.
Like, ugh.
In all this, in this small little town, like it's when you think of a small town, you think like safety, you don't lock your doors, everyone knows everyone, it's secure. But if they're like mental illness doesn't care about the population and the systems that Canada has to manage mental illness and find people that need help and actually give them help. Uh, that doesn't do good in big cities. It doesn't do good in small towns. And it definitely didn't do good in 1969 when what happened with Fred happened. But we don't know anything about a motive. We know that when Fred McCallum was in prison at 16 years old, he was hearing voices um, and thinking people were talking about him. He was said to have a little bit of a like a short fuse and a quick temper. But what his psychiatrist had said during the trial was Fred had told him while drugged. This was another thing too in the trial. They talked about the psychiatrist uh, had given him something that people simply referred to as a truth serum. But the doctor, the psychiatrist said, like, that's not the right thing to call it, but it just gets him to open up. And I think what it is, I don't know the name of the drug, but it's something that will make it prevents you from forming new memories. So if you're kind of like delusional and you're making up stuff as you go, this drug makes it so that you can't do that. You can only rely on memories that you already have. So I guess it gets closer to the truth. But anyway, when under using this drug to get Fred to talk, Fred had explained that he had homicidal urges, but it was targeted towards police. He wanted to kill a police officer, and he had visions of killing a police officer, and for some time wanted to do it, but never actually took steps to do it. And Fred, from the beginning of being arrested until the very end of him talking publicly, has said he doesn't know why he did this. He had nothing against the Pedersons. That some of the victims were actually like people he saw as friends. And he said, Fred had said, "I love kids and kids love me, and I have always loved the Pederson kids." So,
And then when he was asked about the other young man that committed the Shell Lake massacre,
yeah,
Fred really was like talking bad about the guy, saying like, I could never imagine shooting an infant. And I'm like, but you killed a whole family too. What's wrong with you?
yeah, it is something. But as far as the story, I think like things to consider on the tail end of it is does the if Fred was not criminally responsible and went through therapy or whatever, and somebody with a knowledge of his treatment said like he's safe to be in the public now and released him, should the surviving family members have information on where he is?
Oh, absolutely. 100%.
Yeah,
They
I feel
should
the
have
same.
the information first, and it should be like publicly available.
If it was, I think it's a more easy decision to make if he was like actually guilty of the crime and there wasn't that whole NCR sort of thing, the not criminally responsible thing. I think it'd be a more open and shut decision. But I wonder if that makes it a bit harder for them to release his
Oh.
information. I don't know. I still think they should.
Yes, it is actually,
Maybe they don't need to
because
be like, here's his home address and here's a photo of what he looks like, but they should at least be like that he got, maybe give them some info on his treatment and maybe tell them what province he's in or something.
you'd think like bare minimum,
Yeah, although I don't know
but
what good that would do, but
at least it would give the victims maybe a little bit of peace of mind.
rather than just being a closed door in front of them.
Exactly. But no, I think you're right with the whole, not guilty or not criminally responsible. I'm pretty sure, and like back in the 80s, 90s, if you were found not criminally responsible or, not guilty by reason of insanity, I'm not sure of the rules or the stipulations, but I'm sure you could like apply for a pardon and it would clear your record.
Hmm.
Because I read about how I found out about Oak Ridge was I did a case about Peter Woodcock, and then there was a little thing in one of the books I read about a guy who was a former inmate. So he had like a criminal history for killing whoever, but because he was pardoned, he could like sign other inmates out because he was a free man with no criminal record.
Wow.
Yeah.
Um,
So definitely a thing.
so you know Shell Lake, the Shell Lake murders better than I do. Again, it happened a little over 300 kilometers away from the Buffalo Narrows murders, 17 months earlier. What are the similarities between this case? Starting with, again, we've already talked about in Shell Lake, the family that was murdered is Pederson, P-E-T. In Buffalo Narrows, it's Pederson, P-E-D, like Delta. What other similarities are there?
Not only that, but there was one surviving child in the house. The Shell Lake massacre, there was a 4-year-old daughter that survived, and then the 7-year-old son in Buffalo Narrows.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the farmhouses were quite similar as well. 2-bedroom, the kids were all in one room, the parents in another. Someone was found in the living room. It's very odd, very eerie.
Shell Lake was a shooting, right?
Shooting, that's right. But the perpetrator was also a young man. He was only 21, found not guilty by reason of insanity, schizophrenia, also sent to Oak Ridge.
Well, let's move on. Is there anything else we want to say about this story before we do?
I don't think so.
So I got something else in store for us here.
Oh, well, don't keep us in suspense.
Let's end with, and I'm going to start doing this going forward. Since we're going to combine all of everything we do together under the Canadian Gothic brand, what I'm going to do is any listener mail we get related to any of our past stories, I figure as it comes in, we can end our episodes reviewing it because we have gotten quite a few pieces of mail related to past stories. So I think this would be a good time, if you're settled in your seat there,
I am.
to go through a few because I got a handful of them here.
I'm excited.
Good. Do you want to start off heavy or light?
Oh, let's start off light.
Okay. Here's a light one. Our favorite topic will come back to haunt you.
Oh no.
You know what it is.
I absolutely do.
This is from Kristen. I got this about a week ago.
Hi, Jordan. I'm Kristen. I'm also in Halifax. I just finished listening to your episodes on the TTC murders, and I had a really good laugh over the whole roly-poly debate. I wanted to add a little something to that. For starters, I'm older than the roly-poly-oly show, but my brother grew up watching it, so I'm very familiar with that. So that reference did not get lost on me. However, you had somebody suggest that the roly-poly was those toys with the weighted bottom and you'd push them around and they'd right themselves. Those were actually called Weebles. Their slogan was Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. So I'm assuming the woman at the subway station was referring to the bug that I grew up calling a potato bug, but I'm assuming that's a roly-poly because they tuck up like an armadillo and roll around. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Do you know what they weeble and they wobble, but they just don't fall? Do you know what those toys are?
It definitely rings a bell.
Maybe it's older than you, but I do remember toys called the Weebles, and I remember a song like they weeble and they wobble, but they don't fall down. But I think the Weeble was like a brand of roly-poly toy.
Totally.
The roly-poly toy is a thing. Like that's a style of toy that's bottom heavy and rounded, so as you push it, it will always correct itself. But
maybe the Weeble Wobble was like a knockoff.
Well, I think I don't know if roly-poly as a toy is like a brand. I think it's more like a type of toy.
Okay.
So there's probably multiple brands of roly-poly toy. Like for example, I don't know, like action figure. There's all different sorts of action figures. You know, like there's G.I. Joes and there's Transformers and whatever.
Right.
They're all action figures, but I think there's all sorts of roly-polies as well, just probably not as many as there are action figures. And a Weeble is one. Um,
It's a
so,
genre.
but I still don't know what she was referring to. That doesn't solve the mystery.
We need to track her down. We need to find her.
That's what it may have to come to.
What were you talking about? What did you mean?
Yeah, I'm just shocked at how much that has resonated with people to try to solve that. Here's another one. This is a question from the episode we did about Tamara Keepness.
Hi, Jordan. This is Melissa calling from BC. I've been listening to your podcast for forever, and your missing in Canada cases just always make me cry. Now, one thing that occurred to me when I was listening to the Tamara Keepness series is you mentioned that an elder in her village, and it was interesting because it was the first time the police had actually put any credence into visions and what have you, had a vision that she was in a well, and I was wondering if anyone had ever thought about the abandoned oil wells. I could have sworn it was a long time ago in your podcast that you had discussed orphan wells, but it's entirely possible it was a completely different Canadian podcast that I listened to. But there's abandoned oil wells all over the prairies. And I just thought, it occurred to me that that might be something that would be very akin to what the elder had envisioned, but not a water well. And I did not know how to contact anybody to put words to this other than you. So I'm hoping you can do something with that. Love your show. Thanks so much. Take care. Bye.
Let's talk about it. So
Interesting.
So for people who don't remember that case, Tamara Keepness was a child, a young girl who went missing. Years later, an elder from I don't know if it was from the community she grew up in, had said they believed that she was in a well, and they searched. I believe they searched wells in like the community.
I think on her reserve.
On her reserve, yeah, and never found anything. But she taught this whole thing with orphan oil wells. That wasn't something talked about on my show. I don't know that concept. Do you know anything about that? You're in the prairies, aren't you?
I don't know about these orphan oil wells, but I know that there are abandoned old oil wells. Yeah,
That must
everywhere
be
across the prairies.
That must be what it is. We don't have that in Nova Scotia. I've never heard of an abandoned. We have abandoned mines because we would have had a lot of coal mines and stuff.
Oh yeah.
I've never heard of like an abandoned oil well, but yeah, anything like that. If someone, when you hear people trying to hide bodies, they look for somewhere to put them where people aren't going to be searching, and it seems like an abandoned oil well would probably be high on the list of places to put someone where someone's not going to be walking through there or something. But yeah, that's kind of
I never would have thought of that.
No, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that could be something, but I'm often when it's someone's tip is based on like intuition and all this sort of thing, and it seems like that's kind of what the elders was. I don't know how serious police would take that. I don't know if they would go very far down that road, but
Well, and especially almost 20 years later, they'll
was,
say, "Well, we searched the wells."
But if it was if her remains were in an a well or something, it wouldn't be exposed to the elements. But then again, there'd be water down there. I'm just thinking there'd probably be some pretty good.
I'm trying to figure out what an old, abandoned, dried up oil well would look like.
How deep?
Because I know what they look like from afar. I've never investigated one.
No, you don't go messing around. I've never seen one in my life.
Oh, they're cool.
Okay, now we started off lighter. This one I think is a heavy one.
Okay.
I've mentioned this to you when I got this voicemail. So let's see how we respond to this. Here it is. I should also say Bree addresses it to Jordan and Aaron, but it's feedback of Jordan and Madelayne's episode about the TTC.
I'm gonna let Aaron take the blame.
Yeah, let's see. And it may not be you or Aaron. This may be something I said. I don't recall exactly who said this, but listen to this.
Hi, Jordan and Aaron. This is Bree from Pennsylvania. I'm calling about your last episode on the Toronto Transit. I think it was released on the 5th. I want to say this in the most respectful way possible. I know, sorry, Aaron, that you guys have been receiving a lot of flack lately, and I don't want you to take this in any sort of like aggressive manner or like criticism. I'm just trying to help. I wanted to say that when you were talking about the victim, you said that she was lucky that she survived or that her injuries weren't worse. I think that is great sentiment, but when it comes to actually being the victim, victims don't want to hear that they were lucky. It doesn't matter that they survived or whatever. They don't feel lucky because they have this trauma. And actually, some victims experience trauma that makes their life so unlivable that they wish that they didn't live. So to say, oh, you're lucky to live, that is really crappy for some people. Obviously, that's few and far between, but even still, oh, you're lucky that, you didn't lose an eyeball or whatever. Like, not everybody feels that way. I know you didn't mean it that way, but I just wanted to say that.
So yeah, just they mixed up a little bit about which episodes were involved, but I think we got the gist. And if I remember correctly, the woman who described rolling out of the way like a roly-poly from the train after being pushed onto the tracks in the episodes that we did about the Toronto transit system, we probably said she's lucky to have not been hit by that train, lucky to be alive. The caller, Bree, I think was referring to like the idea of survivor's guilt, which is a real
Oh,
thing.
yeah.
People, like, I'm sure if we could talk to Donnie or Cynthia or Connie from the Buffalo Narrows axe murders, I'm sure they could tell us all about survivor's guilt. But I get the sentiment of it. But I think when we were talking about it, this is my response. I would say we were just talking not to her, but to each other, saying she very easily could have died. And I think being alive is better than dead. And I think she was lucky that she didn't get hit by the train and survived. If I was talking to her, though, I don't think I would say, oh, like, you're lucky that you're alive. I don't think I would
Right.
say that.
I'm sure this caller is talking about the stabbing incident. I'm positive.
Really? What makes you say which?
Because I specifically remember saying this woman is lucky she didn't lose an eye because she was stabbed in the head.
Oh, okay. And I assume she was just, the caller was just giving an example, like if someone lost an eye. But yeah,
Oh,
you
no,
remember.
no.
Okay, so
Yeah,
this
I
is,
said that.
uh-oh.
Oh.
And I think when people give feedback like that on something you said, and not, it wasn't like, I don't find it critical. It doesn't hurt my feelings or anything, but it just makes you realize kind of the importance of language and how you say things. But I think when you and I are talking, our conversation isn't for, like, I think the people involved in any of the stories that we're covering, this probably is, they shouldn't listen to this podcast, I would say. And because it's not that we're like talking like negatively or anything, but we're not talking to them, we're talking to each other about their story. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah, we're commentating on their story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
But
I could see how I wouldn't want to listen to that.
yeah, but I think, but I stand by, if it was me who said it, I stand by it. I think everybody who almost dies that survives is lucky.
Me too. If I got repeatedly stabbed in the head with a Swiss Army knife and didn't lose an eye, I'd be like, I have both my eyes after a head knife attack.
Yeah. But then you'd have to deal with, like, why did the other person get killed and I lived?
Oh, totally.
But I think, yeah. So
There's 1,000 different
yeah,
what word am I looking
I would
for?
say, like, you're lucky to be alive, but you're not coming out of it unscathed. So
No,
life is
exactly.
different and it's hard now, but luckily you have more days on this planet, like above ground.
Right. Exactly. Which is the main goal, is to keep living.
Yeah. It seems it's the bare minimum, right, of
Right.
accomplishment.
It's the bare.
But either way, I appreciate when people either like question or give a different way to look at it. And maybe we should have had like a
It's
bit of conversation.
perspective.
Yeah, and maybe should have had a conversation around survivors' guilt and how these people who survive these things should or what they could be going through later in life. So I appreciate it. And even regardless of all that, I appreciate any feedback. Someone who, like, when you make a podcast, it's easy to feel like you're like alone in this vacuum, or it's just me and Madelayne like sitting here talking to our laptops to each other. But when you get feedback from someone, good or bad, it reminds you that other people are listening, and it's not just the two of us wasting our time here. People
Totally.
are getting something out of it. So I appreciate any feedback. With that, though, let's start wrapping this up. Let's talk about you, though. What do you got coming up? What did you just release? You just did a list of documentaries.
I did. I released my top 5 favorite true crime documentaries last Saturday.
Okay.
And
like a real YouTuber. That's like such a YouTuber thing to do.
Well, the people asked, so I gave them what they wanted.
All you can do. Do you got anything interesting coming up?
I'm going to release a video about the Pederson family and the Buffalo Narrows massacre on Tuesday. And then after that, I've got I'm trying to figure out, because Easter's coming up, so I want to do something with like a Catholic Church scandal, but I don't know if I want to make it more than one part.
Oh, that's some heartwarming stuff. I thought you were going to say I was going to do like a resurrection kind of episode. Like if you could find like a story of someone who died but then came back at the last minute. Wouldn't that be a twist on like some Easter content?
I think Moist has a song called Resurrection.
Oh, here we go. With your West Coast crap. Don't mention that band on the show. David Usher is banned from listening. If you're listening, David, unsubscribe.
He's just kidding. We love you. We, both of us.
Oh yeah, absolutely. You hear the stories of people where it's like they were in the morgue or they were about to be buried and then they just came back to life. I don't know if there's any Canadian...
I've never heard of a story like this.
They seem to always happen in like weird other parts of the world. You read about it. I've heard a bunch of stories about that. I don't know if any of them are true, but I don't think there's any Canadian ones.
Oh yeah. Well, you know what? You've inspired me. That's something interesting to look into.
Maybe a long time. They used to, when they would bury people, they used to have a glass kind of window on the casket so you could see the face of the dead body. That way, if they woke up, you could see. And they used to also have some caskets or tombstones back in the day had a little bell on them in a way that if you woke up in the casket, you could do something and make the bell ring.
I've heard of that. And there's a saying that has something to do with, Saved by the Bell. That's where Saved by the Bell comes from. That's right.
Yeah. So
interesting.
It can happen. But wouldn't it be a cool twist on an Easter special if you came up with something like that?
It would be, actually. Yeah. Let me look into that.
Look into that. All right. Well, whether or not you find it, I'll watch what you do for Easter. But let's wrap this up. Madelayne, it's always great to talk to you, even if the topics are so heavy and complicated.
Well, thank you for having me as always.
I want to thank you for joining Madelayne and I for this episode of Nighttime. Now, I'm going to start wrapping up this episode, but before we part, I have some thanks. A big thanks to Monty Datta, who contributes the music for this series, and to LJ from Dystopian Simulation Podcast, who provides the series intro and outro voiceovers. But lastly, and most importantly, I have a massive thanks to every one of you who listened to Nighttime, as without your interest and your support, this show would be as pointless as it would be impossible. And on the topic of support, let me thank the newest subscribers of the premium feed. Tanya, Heidi, and Don, thank you for your generous support. And for anyone else who'd like to support the show, you can help keep the show alive by simply sharing this episode on social media and letting some like-minded friends know what we're doing here. If you have any story ideas, want to give feedback on the show, or would like to contribute a voice memo to be aired and responded to in an upcoming episode, you can do all that and more at nighttimepodcast.com. We hope to hear from you. But until then, take care of each other, hug your loved ones tight, and let me know if you see anything weird.
The Nighttime Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Jordan Bonaparte.